I'm Rachel Mueller, professor for the studies, and interviewing Professor Tom Davis on occasion of his retirement after 36 years.
Yeah, I was 37. Yeah.
Yep. So we asked some questions about his history at Indiana University and the history of the department. So maybe you could say a little bit about how you ended up at IUPUI in 1989.
Okay. When I came to IUPUI in 1989, it had been, of course, after searching desperately for a job, as many people in graduate school end up having to do. I was kind of lucky myself that year, though. I had worked for a small publishing arm of a library association, so I had some editorial experience. And I had also maintained a pretty active role in Presbyterian ministry. So when I went on the job market, I was able to obtain three very different offers, job offers. One was as a chaplain slash teacher at a small Presbyterian liberal arts college, where I would teach half time and be a chaplain half time. The second offer was actually from a denominational publishing company to join them as an editor. And those were two pretty good job opportunities. And then I got a call from a fellow named Tony Sherrill at IUPUI, a state institution. I hadn't particularly been looking at state schools in terms of employment. Indianapolis pretty close, so I'll come on down and interview and see what's up. And I will say that Professor Sherrill had the most robust and eloquent pitch for why one should teach in not just a state university, but a state university like IUPUI. And he talked about how what IUPUI was building and what we were doing here was education for democracy, to help the citizenry develop their critical thinking skills in order to become, in a sense, better citizens, but, in the process, better prepared for the job market and also better prepared for life, and to become, in some ways, a better person. And so he saw as both a personal, a professional, and civic education that was being made available to people who would not necessarily be able to get it otherwise. At that point in time, IUPUI was more or less an open admission university, and because of that, he thought it was especially imperative that we do reach out and teach those who might otherwise not have the opportunity that others have. And so he thought it as a matter of equity, really, in some ways, that this be made available to students. And so coming down, I was very taken by his vision of what the school would do. He talked about how I began on the building up of the school and the department. Both he and others in the school had a vision for what the school could become. And at the time, this was very much, like I said, an open admission, commuter school. There was so few resources in some way. But there was a group of people who were determined not to let that stand in the way of creating a first-rate university. And that was their vision, and actually I think that is something that they actually did. And if one looks at certain kinds of ratings these days, if you would thought back in 1989, you would have thought it impossible that IUPUI and now IU Indy would find themselves ranked in a number of different kinds of rating systems as really a quality institution. And I'm very proud that he lured me here. Had the opportunity to leave over the years, a number of different times, but something about the vision he presented presented has always kept me here. And the mission that he laid out has always been appealing to me.
So you've been here, you knew the founders of the department, right?
Yes.
Could you say a little bit about the origins of the Religious Studies department? How did the Religious Studies program come to be a public university, and why did it, I mean, it really has been a central aspect of the School of Liberal Arts. So what was that department like when you came? And
Right. In terms of how the department came together, because IU Indy is a state school, and if you think back to its origins, it's not the kind of school that would necessarily have a religious studies department, because you do not, in fact, find a religious studies department in every state school. In each state, there's usually at least one or two schools that will have a religious studies department, but it is a bit unusual. For example, IU Bloomington had a religious studies department, but it was the only state school really to have a full-fledged department at the time. Part of how it came about here in Indianapolis is through a grant through the Lilly Endowment. And so Jan Ships had been hired as a history professor, but she also, since her topic was Mormonism, did some teaching in religion as such, teaching Mormonism. And through the Lilly grants, the school was able to hire another faculty member, and that faculty member was a person named Jim Snurl, and he became the founding department chair for religious studies. And what's more, Professor Snurl actually left a tenure-track job from Oklahoma. I can't remember the time if he was at Oklahoma State or the University of Oklahoma, but he left a tenure-track position to come here and found the department. And so we started out with a person whose field was ethics, religious ethics, with someone who did religious history. And one began to build from there with the resources that they had, and working with the dean and the school and the endowment funds. The department then hired another half-time member, and that was Tony Sherrill. Tony was hired half-time in the English department and half-time in the religious studies department. Professor Sherrill had an MA in English from the University of Kentucky, and his PhD, which he was still finishing at the time of his hire, was in religion and literature from the University of Chicago. So he came with the agreement that he would teach half-time in religion and half-time in religious studies. Now, what that meant at the time, which it meant for all professors teaching here, his load half-time in religious studies was 5 courses a year. And he taught 5 courses a year in the English department, because at the time, the standard load was 10 courses per academic year. And so the department grew from there, and in many ways, it kind of feebled in terms of what they could gather that would help them grow. So the next hire was in Bible. So Professor Ted Mullen was hired full-time, but on a temporary basis to test out the Bible curriculum, where he taught the Bible, which turned out to be a very popular course. By and large, all of his Bible courses filled completely, and at that time, it meant 85 students per section. So Professor Mullen was actually teaching hundreds of students per semester. And so after 2 years, he was made a full-time faculty member. And then the department kind of rounded out into its initial shape, which I think of as its founding shape as a department, so that it's really looking like a department. But they hired Professor William Jackson in the mid-80s. Professor Snurl had been hired in Professor Cheryl, 75 to 76, and Professor Ships in the mid-70s. So Professor Mullen, mid-80s, and then we get Professor Jackson in the mid-80s. Again, on a temporary basis. It's all full-time. It was all religious studies. He didn't have to divide his time with other departments. But again, it tested out of the curriculum. And he was in Eastern religion, so he became our expert, particularly in Buddhism and Hinduism. And again, his courses proved to be quite popular. And so with his addition and with his move to full-time a little later in the 80s, you had the five, what you consider the foundational full-time tenure track faculty for religious studies. Professor Ships, Professor Spurl, Professor Cheryl, Professor Mullen, and Professor Jackson, covering a pretty wide range of topics at that time.
And what have been some of your favorite courses to teach, and what do you like about teaching IUPUI students?
Well, it's interesting. I actually like to teach. I've taught lots of different things. I enjoy teaching introductory courses. One of the really giants in the field of history of Christianity, which is the field that I'm in, history of Christianity and history of Christian thought, but one of the giants in the field was a fellow named Yaroslav Pelikan, who taught among other places at the University of Chicago and at Yale University. And Professor Pelikan used to argue that the only people who should be teaching introductory courses were full professors. Because he said it was only full professors who had been in the field long enough to really have a sense of the fullness of a particular field in a way that they could really teach introductory students the fullness of the field. He always argued that people straight out of graduate school should continue to own the area that they're in before branching out into other areas. I kind of like it from the start, and I've done that all the way through. So I've enjoyed teaching Introduction to Religion and revising it greatly over the years. I look back at my initial foray into teaching Intro to Religion, look at my notes, and weep for my students who had to take those courses, because I taught pretty much like I had been taught. So I came in and lectured 3 exams, and that's it. Up a little course, you get a paper thrown in, and that was the best exams. It was pretty fearsome. And but as I grew as a teacher, as I hope all teachers do grow, I learned some things, especially I learned about a bit more about active learning. So I began to lecture less and try to have students talk more, and then move from them talking more to engaging them in in-class projects and having them engage in group work, so that I did not talk so much. And then always worked well with introductory courses, and like I say, expanding them quite a bit, so that by the last time I taught Introduction to Religion, instead of talking so much about theories, I would do things like have them read Kurt Vonnegut's novel, Cat's Cradle, and then take the religion that is founded in that novel by a certain person, Cananism, and then have the students analyze the made-up religion. Telling them to understand, of course, that in the same way, all religions are made through the process of culture. And so that was a great deal of fun. Other introductory courses I enjoyed over the course of time was an East-West course that I developed late in my life, in my career, teaching with another professor in Eastern languages and culture, where we co-taught, trying to get at big issues, how East and West come at things differently. I moved out of my comfort zone into things like Norse saga and myth, and spent quite a bit of time preparing myself to be able to teach that course at an introductory level. I did get to teach in my area of expertise, such as the Reformation. I didn't teach it very often because I found by and large that's not quite the sort of thing that students really wanted to come to. But I had enough students to offer the courses, and so those were fun. In some ways, the most fun courses were those that relied on multimedia, so that I was able to develop courses, the kinds of courses I couldn't really imagine when I first began, that included movies, art, songs, hymnody, things of that nature, videos, music videos. Um,
Are you speaking? I'm thinking of streaming demons and also the history of Jesus. No, which is the Jesus and film. What was that one?
We did streaming demons, which is strictly streaming TV shows. It was a great deal of fun. I started out with a course called Images of Jesus, which involved all those things I just talked about. But when we revamped the curriculum, I did not get that moved into the general education curriculum, so that became more difficult to offer. So then I began offering a course that someone else had developed that was very broad-based and people could kind of approach it in different ways. So I ended up incorporating a big deal about Images of Jesus course into Introduction to the Bible, because on earth Jesus figures pretty prominently in the Bible, so that seemed to make sense to me. So I took that and then kind of built from that. Of course, a Bible and culture course is going to give us a lot more than just about Jesus, but at least it served as a foundation for me. And it gave me ways of thinking about the course, so that again, we almost, at least in the beginning, would begin the course with music videos of relatively contemporary, either contemporary artists or well-known artists, even if older, still folks still new, still know. And looking at, well, gosh, look at all the biblical imagery that's in that song that women don't even think about. We get groups like Clark and Poe, a couple of sisters who aren't super well known, but in certain circles, and certainly among musicians, they're extremely well known. They have a great song called Holy Ghost Fire, where they use all of this Holy Ghost imagery. The image of the Holy Ghost coming down on the apostles with fire. They use a notion from the Christian New Testament, particularly in the book of Acts, when the holy fire comes down on the apostles and testifying of their life music, right? That their fingers are on fire. That the Holy Ghost is coming into them to produce this kind of music. It's a great song. People find it hard to believe when I play this song. The very first national appearance of Willie Nelson, and I'm still a little awed by the fact that my 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old, 22-year-old students all know Willie Nelson, more so than they know anybody else we bring up during the semester. It's kind of odd that they know Willie Nelson, they know Johnny Cash. The very first time Willie Nelson, who sang in a suit, it was very clean cut. The very first time he sang on national TV, he sang a song called The Family Bible. Okay, well, that's pretty interesting. And then we go through, of course, country music. That's kind of a Bible soaked tradition, if you like. But then, of course, we go through music by Kendrick Lamar or Taylor Swift. Again, Poets Department, again, you start listening for it, it's just littered with biblical imagery. And so that's been a lot of fun to try to connect the dots there for people to say, why put that in a public song? song that you assume that no one will connect to. By and large, what you want are hit songs if you're a successful musician. Uh, so yes, it's personal to them, but it's something that they resonate. And by and large, based on discussions we have afterwards among all the students, we let them figure out what does resonate. And images of the devil, I'd have the kids go out, and I'd show them first and say, hey, look, I found these images of the devil. Oh, look at this NASX video on Dirty. Gosh, why is he using the image of the devil in this video? What's he trying to say? And then I said, why don't you go out and see if you can find some images of the devil? And so it's one of the most fun classes because there's one, I don't have it with me, but I do have a trident that I bring to class. And I used it as my pointer. And in order to present their devil images, they have to use the trident and point. So that's a lot of fun. And they bring images that they find from art through all different centuries, all different countries, music. It doesn't have to be an image as such, it can be music. And of course they can't do the devil goes down to Georgia because that's not the songs I play, that's the music video I play. Again, I'm astounded by all the people who know the Charlie Daniels band still, and who know that song specifically. Of course, they come up with all kinds of songs that have references to the devil. And so, or they find TV shows that again, I showed them clips from a show called Lucifer, which was a great show. Had lots of very interesting places where you could delve into religion and culture, Bible and culture. So that was a great class to teach too, and it was just a joy to teach. In fact, I didn't realize it at the time, but that was actually the last class I ever taught in person was the Bible and culture. And it ended up being a really great class with really great students.
Could you draw on traditional scholarly materials for your teaching and also pop culture? It seems like there's a parallel in your writing as well. That you've written many scholarly works, and you've also written fictional works. Is there any relation between the two, or?
Well, I write scholarly books, so if you ever thought to yourself, I can't go to sleep, maybe John Calvin would do it. And after 2 or 3 pages of Bible, you'll go to sleep. And as for people, scholarly books on John Calvin, by and large, are for people who have to read it for their job. I write novels for fun, but it also ties into religion in a way. It may be a little less apparent in the early novels because I've written a couple books that are somewhat Christmas themed, although it's not set at Christmas time for the most part, it's just that the day of launch, so to speak, comes at Christmas time. But there's actually religion woven into the novels in the sense that these are people who lead a religious life. And lead a religious life that maybe a lot of people aren't aware of. I mean, this is by and large Appalachian Mountain religious life. So it kind of exposes it to that. And actually, I used to do, back in the day, I used to do a lot of presentations, book club presentations, book presentations on radio presentations. For example, in 2002, I can't quite remember. Anyway, I was on like 50 radio stations at one point talking about the book. And it was always an opportunity to talk about religion, right? People didn't buy the book because they thought, oh, boy, this is about religion. But they gave me a chance to talk about how, actually, because of the way the book unfolds, I get to talk a little bit about religion and what it was like and what it meant to them and what it meant to be religious. And some imagery, if you like, from that kind of religion that they may not have been aware of. And actually, I've had people who are even in the field of American religion who said, I actually didn't know this. This was really interesting. It's imagery like that I think is really helpful. Help people understand that even the lesser known things about religion can still have a bigger point about what religion is about, right? Which is why St. Catholic Church. I was thanks at the time, but I was there actually as a part of a religious singing group, but we made sure the saints weren't going to come out. They didn't. But I've always been interested in them because one, they are a very small group. Two, they tend to be Appalachian, but not entirely. But three, it gives you all kinds of insight into the Bible and how it gets interpreted. The Bible says, don't pick up snakes. So why does nobody else picking up snakes? Okay. There's actually a movie about it. There was a popular Hollywood movie about it. It's still in follow. It starred Walter Coggins. He's hugely known for things like Fallout and White Lotus, for example. He stars in this really good movie about St. Catholic churches. So it's a way of bringing things into a book that, again, give the text texture, context, and then if one chooses, and entree into a way to explore religion. Now, a later novel is a little more explicit. It's called The Devil Likes to Sing. Okay, that was pretty apparent. But again, what I got to do with that book, in a very fun way, I can say nothing else about the book. It was the most fun book I ever wrote. I got to incorporate all kinds of things about the history of Christianity in kind of a fun way. And in a way that may or may not be entirely true. Partly because in the book, the devil takes responsibility for all the great theological developments in the world. It also takes responsibility for great art and great music and all that kind of stuff. And as I say in the back of the book, and I say at the end, the devil probably should not be taken as the final authority on all things related to church history and thought. But it gives me a chance to play with it, right? And to read not just great art and great music, etc., but also the more popular stuff as well. So I believe, I'm not sure, but I think I have one song that's got a cross in there. I know I have Mary Chapin's Carpenter Shut Up and Kiss Me, which plays out in a fun scene. But again, the context says, okay, now, why is the devil singing that song in that context? And what are they doing? And how does it play out later as the guy himself, the protagonist, is trying to think through his relationship with the devil? Because at first, his relationship with the devil was a pretty good deal for him. Until it's not. So yeah, it's been fun to see how these things can work. Actually, I've tried to weave together the more popular and the academic by doing work on a novelist called Marilyn Robinson, who has as many awards as we have named, how to name. But she writes both fiction and non-fiction. And she has an interest in the tradition of John Calvin, which is an area of mine. And so I've now written about her, trying to understand both her interest in and how she interprets John Calvin, and what it says about her and the broader culture that she writes a book that sells well, that's about John Calvin. As a matter of fact, she has a funny chapter about John Calvin in the midst of her second non-fiction book, but it's actually her first book of essays, called The Death of Adam. In the very middle of the book, she has two chapters entitled Margaret of Navarre, who is somebody who read John Calvin. But she says at the very beginning, she says, the reason I named this Margaret of Navarre, is not because it has anything to do with Margaret of Navarre. It doesn't. This is all about John Calvin. But if I had titled it John Calvin, it would skip over these chapters. So she was probably right. So what she tries to do is do something that I had done, and actually I had corresponded with her briefly through email sometime back in the days. After I had published an article on images of John Calvin in American 19th century textbooks, where I was trying to do something in a more academic way that she was trying to do in disabuse the public of some of the stereotypes about John Calvin. And I can say, frankly, that neither one of us has been particularly successful at that. Because if I look at current AP history exams on that period of time in history, the only thing generally that's mentioned about John Calvin are the two stereotypical things that wildly mistake what he was really about. Still, try. And in that way as well, try to relate what I do academically, with something that's happening in the broader cultural world through the literature of someone like Marilyn Robinson.
People can probably hear from the twinge of Southern accent that remains, which I'm guessing probably is not as strong as it once was, or changes when you go back to Georgia. I'm curious how your background fed into the work that you do.
You know, there was somewhat of a joke around the school APY by the time I'm here in the late 80s, early 90s, that the Religious Studies Department at IUPUI was really the Southern Studies of religion, because almost everyone from the department, with the exception of Bill Jackson, was from the South, right? North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, Alabama, I'm from Georgia. Ted Mullen and Tony Sherrill from North Carolina, Jen Schitz was from Alabama, Carmen Cherry was from Texas. He came just before I came. I'm the person from Georgia. The accent I have isn't as strong as it used to be, and I do not have a classically Southern accent. People realize it sounds somewhat Southern, but it's not the, oh, hey, y'all, how you doing? That's South Georgia, not North Georgia. Those folks are entirely different. I come from it's interesting, actually I have an interest in this. I come from a linguistic group called the Central Mountain, sorry, I'm getting older. It's a dialect group from Western Carolina, North Georgia, and Eastern Tennessee. It's a group of people primarily from Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. It's kind of interesting because at one point there was a linguist who argued that Elizabethan language was better preserved in that dialect group than anywhere else in the United States. Now, here we're talking still in the 40s and 50s, probably, before TV becomes so widespread that, by the time you're in the 70s, 80s, 90s, that's beginning to have an effect on it. But it's kind of interesting if one were to look at some of the dialect I use, for example, in my books, in the speaking of the natives, there are words that you can trace directly to Elizabethan dialect. Twerk, for example. When I was growing up, twerk was very, very prevalent. Twerk no matter. But if you like Shakespeare, there's twerk. Actually, so natives comes from E. That's very prevalent in Shakespeare's word twerk. There are other examples of that. I've been to the Southern dialect, but not to because the South has a variety of dialects, but like I said, the South Georgia, South Carolina, and Southern Alabama, I think that's the one people associate, particularly when people make two syllables out of one word.
What about like could? That's a construction I think I first heard from you.
I could. The other thing that the Southern people tend to do, both from my dialect and the other, is they pile on adjectives. Verbs. I kind of thought I would go ahead and take off to town. Now, you say, going to town, right? A lot less words, but there's a tendency to lengthen sentences and to throw in a lot of weren't going to do that after all. I mean, again, there's a lot of ways to shorten those sentences, but by and large, again, my first two novels have a lot of that in it. To the irritation of some reviewers, in particular white dialect, which is fine, as people with different preferences. But there's an important point that Jeff Mason brought up, though. Dialect does not make people stupid, right? And I know you didn't mean that. But I would always remind people, for example, that in national TV, if you want to make somebody sound stupid, you give them a southern dialect, whether they're from the South or not. So in the 80s, 90s, there was this show called Newhart. And it's set in New Hampshire, the wild one, I think I'm quite rich.
They were terrible New Hampshire accents.
In New Hampshire, but there is three rural characters, brothers, Larry, Daryl, and Daryl. And Larry, Daryl, and Daryl speaking in southern accents. Why? I'm sure there's a rural New Hampshire accent, but they were saying about that. University of Chicago, the dean of students was from the South at first, and told me, you should know that every time you open your mouth, they will assume you don't know as they do. So, and this came out even in my novel, because in my novel, the protagonist becomes a doctor, and he goes back to his hometown in practice. And a reviewer from Denver, Colorado, said she couldn't get into the dialect at all, especially because most of it was first person, and from this protagonist who becomes a doctor, because she says, no educated person would ever speak like this. I don't know what that means for all the doctors and lawyers and teachers, etc., that I know who live in the area I'm from and speak exactly that way. But I thought it was kind of a nice opportunity because it is clear that the people in the book are intelligent people. Matter of fact, there was a review from I can't remember the second name, it was the major Knoxville, Tennessee newspaper, and what she said was, I'm so glad to read a book that had people talking like me who weren't stupid. So, I guess that's all right. And sometimes I've let my students know, I say, guess where I'm from, and go ahead and get it over with. I let them guess two things. I let them guess, okay, if you can tell me where I'm from because of my accent, that's great. Nobody ever guessed North Georgia. I always ask them, if you can tell me what religion I am, I'll tell you if you're right. Unless they make sure I give the exact religion, okay? And it was kind of funny because people either guessed atheist or they guessed Catholic, of course I'm neither. So, I'm Presbyterian minister, but actually practicing Episcopalian. But neither atheist or Catholic. So I only had one person, 36 and a half years, guess. And I'd always tell them the reason I don't tell you. I mean, there's a lot of reasons to tell people. So possibly whether it's so or not, so that they know where it comes from. But for me, I would say, it's because I don't want to skew how you think we're looking at the material. I don't want you ever to think, well, he's this, so maybe I shouldn't say that. Or he's this, so maybe I should say that. That's the way I did it. And it was always interesting because people, the other interesting thing is it used to be a lot more interested and important to people than it is now in the current context. Because I think in the current context, with the growth of the so-called nuns, the people who have no religious affiliation, it's all less important to them. But earlier in my career, it seemed very important to them, the number of people who would ask me, I'd say, write it down and we'll see. And I get all this, one person in 36 and a half years, correct, guessed correctly. And it was because her father was a Presbyterian minister, and she said, when I taught, I sounded just like him. So.
Yeah, I don't get that question anymore either, but I told them at the end of the semester. So I did find out one year they were taking that. Yeah. Somebody thought I was Jewish and others not. They're friends. I'm neither.
district. Well, of course, to me, what that signals is the person guessing perhaps is Protestant. Or sometimes they will conflate those things, and I went that step part last time. It's abusive in the notion that anybody is a particular religion. But just because it's not your religion doesn't mean that they're not truly religious. So, anyway.
So how would you make the case today for the importance of teaching about religion at a public university at a time when we both have Christian nationalism and, as you mentioned, the rise of the nuns being less important to some people, but a lot more important?
In the modern state university, I believe that the offering, the teaching of religious studies is imperative. And in some ways, I believe it's a real loss if in some places religious studies is no longer being seen as a viable option for students to take. The study of religion, one of the reasons I like it is because it really is an opening onto a way of thinking, and it is also an opening of one's eyes into a larger world, right? I've said this a lot throughout my career, so I think that if anybody's ever heard me talk before, they've heard it and they're sick of me saying it. But a fellow named C.S. Lewis once said in a 1961 book called An Essay on Criticism, he's talking about what's the point of literature. And he says, my own eyes are not enough. I would see through the eyes of others. And in a really, I think, evocative way, he talks about the different ways one could see the world. For example, look into the eyes of some character of a Greek myth onto the skies that night. Looking out onto the seas of a sailor, right? He talks about all these different situations where you could be looking through the eyes of others. He talks at one point about a person who can see through the eyes of animals. And I don't know if he and T.H. White ever talked, but if you look at T.H. White's work on the Arthurian literature material, he actually has a Merlin who turns Arthur into an ant, into a goose, into a fish, so that he can see through the eyes of those animals, right? And then he goes on to say, right, which is we'll see through the eyes of others. And then he says, where does this happen? Well, he knows a number of places where it can happen, but one of the places he talks about literature. He says, when I look through the eyes of literature, I see beyond myself. I see beyond myself, and I am never more myself than when I do. Somebody says it in a much more academic and convoluted way. It's someone who's writing anyway, I've always liked. Raymond, he was a French thinker. And he talks about how, what's the point of history? And he actually talks about how in history you go outside yourself, to the community, to the state, perhaps to the nation, finally to the world, right? And then you begin to work backwards from that in terms of the knowledge that you gain. And he talks about it's only at that point when you have moved beyond yourself as fully as you can and incorporated what you've learned back into yourself. It's only at that point that you are able to transcend, at least in some sense, where you are in time. Right? He talks about how people are locked in caves of circumstance, right? Unless you go through that process. And then you can, in some way or another, at least partially, Because there's so many different ways you can approach it, right? So many different fields that need to inform it, all of which presents us with a broader horizon through which we can see so many more things and not be captured by our own, right, position in time and place. So that when we hear, oh, it's always been this way, we say, no, it's not. Oh, things will never change. Well, no, let's look at this. It has changed. Uh, um, all of history, all of religion. I think they share these two things. Is a process of both continuity and change. And it's not until you get to the point, really, of seeing more widely to understand what's going to make me best able to choose. What I really think in this moment is to realize, okay, where have things changed? And where have things stayed the same? And at that point, look at it and say, okay, on the basis of that, in this moment, I can choose X, Y, or Z. Right? And so, and there are a variety of disciplines that can do that for you, but in some ways I think that the study of religion, since it's so open to the breadth of human experience, and it also has the need for so many different kinds of disciplines to come in to help illuminate what's going on, that just makes for a fantastic entry into the world of critical thinking.
Hallelujah. So what would you say to a concerned 18-year-old worried about going into debt who needs to take a, get a major that's going to have good job prospects?
We can talk about that in two ways. Why is it that a prospective student needs, right, and whether parents want that in order to go through a college experience that even in the state university costs an awful lot. Still, there's ways we can think about it. One, is one primarily interested in job training? Is that the be-all and the end-all of what's desired? If one thinks through what one really wants, that's where they end up. Well, I guess from my point of view, one of the real options it would be trade school, vocational school, different types of internships or apprenticeships, and I would encourage folks to really think about that. There's one way in which more international schools do a much better job than the United States does in terms of thoroughly taking that idea seriously. But unless you have, and those careers are great, and we need them, oftentimes they're well paying. Alright? So why do you need a college degree? When you can apprentice as a pipe fitter, which again is something we need, something that pays well, and for those who do it, a fulfilling profession. Well, it comes down to why is it that you want out of education? Do you want more than simply a trade you're going to have for maybe the rest of your life, or maybe not? There have been a number of people, and I go back to, in some ways, one of the maxims of history is that the more things change, the more they stay the same. Well, that's not quite true.
Anything more you wanted to add to about
reasons for yes. There's a resonance in history, such as if you go back and look, 1995 in Atlanta, there was something called the Congress on Africa, which brought in people from all over the United States. Probably the most famous of those that's remembered today is W.E.B. Du Bois. But there was actually a Methodist minister there who oversaw the education division for the Northern Methodist Church. And in his address, he kind of approached head on one of the issues of the day, and that is, what kind of education should African Americans receive? Because there are two schools of thought. One is that it should be entirely, back then it was called industrial. It should be an industrial education, meaning that they should be trained for trades, by and large kind of manual trades, oftentimes manual trades, but not always, versus what some people would consider something like a college education. So those are just two schools of thought. And what the Methodist ministry said was this. He essentially said, if you're to attain full personhood, you will always need to be more than your work. Right? And he said, insofar as black people are full persons, they need the education of full personhood. And what he argued was not just a college degree, but the liberal arts specifically, right? The opportunity to read the great philosophy, literature, English, etc. Read those things. It's what expanded personhood, what made it possible for someone to realize the full potential that they have as a person. So he said, therefore, what we should be thinking about is not what advances simply technical education, but what advances a fullness of personhood that enables a person to contribute fully and in a living way to our democracy. And so, gosh, that seems to hold to that as well, doesn't it? I mean, you do want a job after college. There are ways to make sure you get a job. There are ways you can train. There are ways you can think about it. However, what is also going to help you develop as a person? What is it that's going to help you develop in such a way that you become the best citizen, the best person, the best professional that you can possibly be? If that's what you want, then you're going to have to at least tie the type of professional education you think you want in college with all the liberal arts that lie underneath the best expressions of those work. And anybody in business, any business out there will tell you that what they want, yes, are people who know business, but also people who know how to think, people who know how to write, people who know how to present, people who know how to work with others, people who know how to connect. And those are skills you learn in the liberal arts and things such as religious studies. Now, two ways to go about it, right? You can do your work in those professional schools and minor in some of these things that you come across in general education that you find particularly interesting or fulfilling. Or you flip that. You major in the liberal arts, but you be sure to do work in other fields, other schools. So, I mean, we've had people who major in religion and they go on to med school. They go on to nursing school, for example, go into business, go into other professions that they think they would find interesting. But the thing is, they have a foundation there, right? And let's be clear, there are fields you can go in which you can get a job right afterwards, such as accounting. With AI, one wonders how long the kind of accounting we have now will be the kind of accounting that we have in the future. On the other hand, you could get a degree in the liberal arts, and like I said, as long as you've been savvy about how you do the coursework, right, you find that you have a lot of different kinds of opportunities that can be fulfilling as you seek a career. There's a little fact I'd like to throw out. There's this place called the Georgetown Institute for the Study of work in education. Everybody assumes everybody's on this, same path. What you don't hear is that let's take engineering, which seems a sure shot for schooling, which we appreciate, because we appreciate all the things that engineers do for us. So I'm not downplaying engineering at all. Da Vinci was an engineer, right? But there's a pretty high burnout rate among engineers. I can't remember the percentage now, but a pretty high percentage burnout after 5 or 10 years. The other thing I'll tell you is after a certain period of time, 20% of history majors make more money than 20% of engineers. Now, that may be really high enough. I am just saying that you don't really know how things are going to work out. And education was important to you as a person. And what fulfills you as a person? What fulfills you is being able to make a living. Of course. But the balance that you need to figure out who you're going to be and what fulfills you most along those 3 lines, civic, personal, professional, is something that you can work out. Frankly, a little arts course is actually a great place to work it out in. Although I will apologize just then for having ended my sentence with a preposition.
Well, maybe we'll end with a softball question.
Okay.
What's the story of your beard?
A beard, yes. Well, I get a lot of comments about it.
Symbolic.
It's a symbol that I lived through COVID. This was my COVID project. I thought, well, nothing else, I watch my beard grow. And so it grew for a few years during COVID for the lockdown. And after a point, you get to where, well, I've done it for this long, I hate to cut it off. So I've just continued to let it grow. I've trimmed it at the very end occasionally. But by and large, I just let it grow. So this has been, starting this month, actually. It's been 6 years in the making. And I do get comments on it. In fact, not to advertise on this video, but I was at a place called St. Richard's School here, where I got my mug, last Friday night, at which point the head of the school said something to me about my beard. I said, thank you very much. But I did hear people saying they like it, so I just wish I'd had it longer for when I was teaching. So I always had a beard, never this long.
All right. Thank you.
It is a pleasure to share with you.